Knowledge of ancient history profoundly affects our interpretation of modern history. With these new insights into the past, you are now ready to begin your field trip. Be mindful that everything you see, from the numbered streets to the street numbers, the shape of the city to its orientation and monuments, all has been carefully determined by men who sought to recreate here along the Potomac the architectural, symbolic, and spiritual culture that once thrived along the Nile. It is our intention to reacquaint you with this ancient wisdom so that you will know who you were, who you are, and who you can become. As you prepare to leave the bus and begin your walk through Meridian Hill Park, sharpen your eye and tune your ear so you'll know what you see and understand what you hear. When you truly understand the extent to which we have been written out of our own history, and others have taken our historical accomplishments and claimed them as their own creation, and then used that information to empower themselves, and then later enslaved us and told us that we had never created anything of worth, and they desire in practically every way possible to reclaim the spiritual essence of Africa, while they have effectively brainwashed us into rejecting the essence of who we are. We have the keys to the knowledge. And all you have to do, sisters and brothers, is to train your eye to understand that those keys are all around you. You can take one here, you can take one there, and begin to unlock the various doors in your mind and literally free yourself. The first system of writing, the first system of government, the first system of language and laws, science, mathematics, and medicine also had their origins in Africa, and their origins in a civilization which reached its height in the nation that was called Kemet, now referred to today as Egypt. And Europeans had a need, had a desire to recreate as best they could the symbolic and architectural legacy of ancient Egypt. They had the desire because for hundreds of years they mistakenly believed that the Egyptians were white because they had been miseducated too. And so if you understand the true origins of ancient Kemet, understand its African origins, and with that understanding you can then move throughout the world and then claim those symbols that are part of your ancestors that have been appropriated by Europeans in order to try to make themselves something that they never were. And so in Washington, D.C., some 13 years ago, I designed a tour, an African-centered tour of Washington, D.C., which analyzed the architecture of that city and interpreted the symbolism related to that architecture in order to establish a fact, a historical fact, that the designers of Washington, D.C. attempted to recreate architecturally and symbolically the spiritual essence of ancient Kemet in order to infuse this newly formed nation with a force which would allow them to become the most powerful ruling body on earth. They have become that. They have become that. But what they also have done is to remove from our memory any knowledge of our links to the symbols that they appropriated from our ancestors. And so it was about 2 years ago when the brothers and sisters here at UAM came to Washington, D.C. for one of my African-centered tours. And I've just had a conversation prior to coming up here, and it appears as though they're going to make arrangements for another tour, African-centered tour of Washington, tentatively on April the 11th. And since you all have taken your last tour, I've added some other components, which essentially puts the nail in the coffin and proves beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly what the Europeans were doing. So when you come to Washington and you see that symbol, the symbol which symbolizes the most powerful nation on earth, is a symbol which represents the resurrection of an African God. We cannot forget that. We cannot afford to disassociate ourselves from the historical significance of that symbol. It represents an African God who was born on December the 25th, at least 6,000 years before their God, Jesus. It represents an African God who was murdered, and after death, his spirit came and impregnated his wife, who was a virgin, and then this virgin woman gave birth to their son, who was born on the same day as his father, December the 25th. And this son was charged with the responsibility of restoring his father's kingdom on earth. Heru. This is what this symbol represents. And we should not allow anyone to misrepresent this symbol. It's also identified as a phallic symbol. The symbol, the meaning of this symbol it has multiple interpretations. And we have to be able to know which interpretation to apply at which particular time. And so this symbol did at one time represent the missing portion of a sar that his wife Aset did not find, his phallus, which was supposedly cut from his body and thrown into the Nile River and eaten by a catfish. But this symbol is a phallic symbol. A phallic symbol, a 555-foot high penis of an African that stands in the center of Washington, D.C. And if you understand that aspect of its history, maybe you can begin to understand why Bill Clinton can't keep his pants zipped up. See, the stuff works both ways. It works both ways. We also need to understand and be very clear of the mission of George Washington and the so-called founding fathers after they won their freedom from England and established this nation. We have to be very clear that the very first act that George Washington initiated was to pull together a team of men, a team of artists and researchers whose responsibility it was to design a symbol which was to represent the heart and soul of this newly developed nation. And so this team took 6 years to study, research, and design the symbol which became known as the Great Seal of the United States of America. So the artist in me asks you all to understand that when an artist is charged with something, a job of that importance, they don't take it lightly, because they know that their work is supposed to stand the test of time. And the men who were responsible for designing this symbol, the men who took 6 years to design the symbol, were very clear about what they were doing. So when you see these symbols, you have to understand that they represented George Washington and the so-called founding fathers' desire to recreate symbolically and spiritually the essence of ancient Kemet here in this country, the United States of America. Are there any pyramids in England, France, Germany, Russia, Nova Scotia, Scotland, Lithuania, Ireland? There were, at last count, 92 pyramids in Egypt, 15 pyramids in the Sudan, south of Egypt, a dozen pyramids in Ethiopia, south of the Sudan. The only place outside of the continent of Africa where you will find pyramids is right here in this hemisphere, in Mesoamerica, pyramids that were built by African people who navigated the Atlantic Ocean somewhere around 1000 BCE and brought with them knowledge of stone construction, concepts of God, calendar, astronomy, and mathematics, which they introduced to the indigenous people. So this symbol is a representation of the industrious nature of African people. So we have to be clear of what this symbol is and whose it is. Front of the Great Seal also speaks to this mission, this desire on the part of the so-called founding fathers to recreate symbolically the essence of ancient Kemet. So when you look at the front of the Great Seal, the so-called emblem of the United States of America, understand that symbol, but more importantly, understand the origins of that symbol. That symbol was copied from the national symbol of Kemet, which was a personification of Heru, the son of Asar and Aset. Heru, the son of God. I understand also the philosophical and spiritual differences between these two symbols. The symbol of ancient Kemet, the symbol of Heru, shows him looking to his right, which symbolizes the future, shows him holding in each of his talons a symbol called a shin, which represents infinity. And above the shin is a symbol called the ankh, which represents life. And so our ancestors were talking about this process of achieving infinite life in the past and in the future. And they knew by understanding your past, by claiming your past, you can then determine what your future was going to be by infusing that information into your knowledge base today. A very simple, very basic, and very fundamental reality. And above his head was a symbol, the sun, which represented Heru, and also represented the creative force which is responsible for the development and the maintenance of all life here on planet Earth. Those who copied the symbol of Heru and created the symbol of the United States of America deviated from this African concept. They showed the eagle, which is a bird that was indigenous to the United States, holding in his claws two oppositional symbols. In the right talon, he holds an olive branch. In the left talon, he holds arrows, symbols of war and peace, which means then that he is always ready to go to war and maybe ask for peace while he can prepare himself to go to war again. All right? The history of this nation was founded in war. The history of this nation was founded in the destruction of the indigenous population, the rape and enslavement of African people, and the use of their labor to build what has become the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. Yes. But also inherent within this symbol is another language of numbers. A language of numbers which speaks to an unspoken way of seeing the universe and seeing and understanding your relationship to the universe. Numbers have meaning, just as letters have meaning when they're combined in a certain order to create words. Words, when strung together, create sentences. Sentences create paragraphs. Paragraphs create concepts and ideas which move and inspire humans. Numbers do the same thing. All right? Numbers do the same thing. So if you were to look at some numbers and understand what they mean, then they would change, that understanding would change the way that you look at everything around you. Because buildings, carvings, statues embody this knowledge of numbers, this science of numbers. For example, the number 1 has always been associated with God, the Creator. The number 2 represents man and woman who come from God. Number 3 represents the union of man and woman, which produces a child. All right, now understand the importance and the value of that fundamental reality. Children come through the union of men and women. Children don't come from 2 men or 2 women. That's Greek. That's Greek nonsense. Children don't come and should not come from men trying to play God and creating babies in test. I'll put this out here, but I guarantee you 100 years from now, humanity will look back on these test tube babies and realize that people were playing Frankenstein and creating monsters without souls. 100 years from now, people will look back and re-examine these scientific accomplishments. The number 4 is a number that symbolizes a cornerstone, a foundation, a base upon which something builds, upon which someone builds in order to position themselves to move forward. That's why Washington, D.C. Brother Jeffries in the house, my brother, Hotep. Brother Jeffries. That is the reason why the city of Washington, D.C., when it was designed, was originally designed to be in the shape of a square, 10 miles by 10 miles by 10 miles by 10 miles. This square, this 4-sided symbol, was to represent the cornerstone, the symbolic cornerstone for the establishment of this new nation here in this country. Everything has meaning, whether you are conscious of its meaning or not. The number 5 has always been associated with man. And the word man in this original context comes from the Sanskrit word which means mind. So the word man has no sexual connotation whatsoever. The word man means mind, just as the word woman means the womb that produces the mind. That is how minds are supposed to come into existence, through the female. Number 5 is associated with man, or the mind, because there are 5 basic parts on the human body. Head, 2 arms, 2 legs. Men have 5 fingers, 5 toes, and 5 senses. That's why the Washington Monument was designed to be 555 feet. The designers of that structure knew that in making it, they deviated from the original formula for designing Tekken. Tekken were always designed so that the capstone of the pyramidion was to be 1/10 of the length of the shaft. Following that formula, the Washington Monument should have been a total of 550 feet high, but they added 5 additional feet in order to incorporate this symbolism of the number 5 in this monument, and to reinforce the fact that this monument was built not to honor a czar, but to honor George Washington. Right? So all of this stuff is encoded in architecture and symbols that are all around you. And doing some research on the African origins of architecture and symbolism, I found some phenomenal things about New York City. Remember the prison in New York City that they tore down that used to be called the Tombs? I want someone in this room, matter of fact, let me just charge somebody in this room with the responsibility of finding and sending to me a photograph, an old photograph of the Tombs. Why? Because that building was originally designed with the facade of an ancient Egyptian temple. If you look at the old photographs of this building, you'll see the papyrus columns, the lotus columns. You'll see the winged sun disk. You'll see Kemetic symbols all over that building. Why? Because 100 years ago, there was a movement within most cities in the United States to build prisons in the shape and with the design of ancient Kemetic temples. Why? Because it was in the Kemetic temples where the consciousness of man was reformed. Hence, reformatories and prisons were modeled after, superficially modeled after the temples in ancient Kemet. Okay? So, people have appropriated our knowledge, our history, and our symbols for thousands of years, empowered themselves with that knowledge while at the same time telling us that Africa made no significant contribution to the development of humanity. They knew that if they could separate us from the power that exists within our very DNA, within our very genetic structure, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, if they could separate us from that knowledge, they could continue to control us. That's the only way they remain in power, through our denial of our true selves. Okay? Civilization, like humanity, began in Africa. And it is in Egypt where we find evidence documenting this nation as one of the most significant civilizations in history. The country we now know as Egypt was founded in 3200 BCE, before the Common Era, and was originally called Kemet. The people of Kemet were lovers of knowledge. They built numerous temples of learning along the Nile, where they perfected the sciences of astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Generations of social scientists developed systems of government, law, and religion which have influenced mankind for almost 6,000 years. These ancient people also studied the heavens, dividing the day into 24 hours and creating the earliest calendar of 365 and 1/4 days. The Step Pyramid was the first building ever constructed, and it still stands in the city of Saqqara. This 19-story skyscraper was built for King Zoser around 2600 BCE. It was designed by Imhotep, the world's first multi-genius. Less than 200 years later, Kemetic architects and engineers built 10 pyramids at the Giza Plateau. The most famous, the Great Pyramid, was built for King Khufu. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was comprised of nearly 4 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. This incredible monument was originally built to a height of 481 feet, that's 48 stories. From the time of its completion, in approximately 2500 BCE, until 1884 ACE, when the Washington Monument was completed, Khufu's pyramid was the tallest man-made object on Earth. The base of the pyramid covers an area of 13 acres, that's 7 city blocks, and each side of the pyramid measures 755 feet, over 2 football fields in length. There is enough stone in the Great Pyramid to build 33 Empire State Buildings, and like the Empire State Building or any other skyscraper, the Great Pyramid was not built by slave labor. It was built by stone masons who were masters of their craft. Every temple in Kemet was built by skilled craftsmen in accordance with precise architectural and engineering plans, and every temple was oriented to the sun or a specific celestial body. Ancient architects believed that a properly constructed and oriented temple would attract a specific nature or aspect of God, whose spirit would dwell in the Holy of Holies inside the temple. Contrary to popular belief, the people of Kemet believed in one God. This supreme creator is often depicted as the sun and is the oldest symbol representing God, the creator of the universe. The sun was called by many names in Kemet. 3 specific names refer to the sun's changing attributes as it journeyed across the sky. When the sun rose in the east, it was known as Khepre. This Kemetic word meant rebirth. When the sun reached its zenith at noon, it was called Re, a name that described the Creator on high. After the sun set in the west, it was called Amen, a Kemetic word meaning hidden or concealed. Many historians acknowledge Kemet as the source of the word Amen, the idea of a ray of sunlight, and concepts of rebirth and resurrection. The people of Kemet understood that the Creator manifests itself in everything: the air, water, earth, plants, and humans. Everything was thought to contain an aspect or principle of the Creator. Each individual aspect was called nature. Every nature was born as a set of twins, male and female Neteru. Each represented the complementary balance of a specific aspect of the Creator. They were, in effect, the many parts of the one supreme Creator in heaven. As we've already noted, symbolism was very important in Kemet. Heru was sometimes depicted as a falcon. This image later became a national symbol. The right eye of Heru was associated with the sun because a falcon has keen vision, and like the sun, the symbol of the Creator, it sees everything and everyone on the earth below. The resurrection of Asar was symbolized by a monolith called a Tekken. So, wherever you see a Tekken, remember that it is an African symbol representing the resurrection of Asar, an African king who died and was resurrected more than 6,000 years ago. It is equally important to remember that after Kemet was conquered, it was renamed Egypt by the Greeks. They also renamed Asar, Aset, and Heru. They called Asar Osiris, they called Aset Isis, and they called Heru Horus. Three of the most important Neteru were Asar, the first king of Kemet, Aset, his queen, and Heru, their son. The story of this African trinity was first recorded more than 6,000 years ago. It has been told and retold so many times that it is now difficult to distinguish myth from history. The story begins with Asar, the man who unified Upper and Lower Kemet and became the nation's first king. Asar introduced agriculture, writing, law, and government, and he was beloved by his subjects. Asar married a beautiful virgin named Aset, but before his honeymoon, Asar was assassinated by his jealous brother Set. Set not only murdered Asar, he also cut his body into 14 pieces and scattered them throughout the land. When Aset learned of the murder and dismemberment of her husband, she flooded the Nile with her tears and then sailed down the river in search of Asar's remains. Wherever Aset found a body part, she washed it carefully and anointed it with oils. Aset only found 13 parts of Asar's body. By assembling all of the parts and wrapping Asar's body in bandages, Aset created the first mummy in history. Naturally, Aset was overcome with grief as she prepared to bury her husband. She grieved because she and Asar had never consummated their marriage, and she would never bear children by the man she loved. Miraculously, before his body was laid to rest, the spirit of Asar visited Aset and impregnated her. 9 months later, Aset, the virgin, gave birth to a son, Heru, on December 25th. This event was recorded in the temples of Luxor and Philae. If this story sounds familiar, remember that it is more than 6,000 years old and has been retold many, many times. Throughout his youth, Heru was told of the great deeds of his father, and he prepared for the day he would avenge the murder of Asar and reclaim his father's kingdom. The battle between Heru and Set was the classic struggle between the forces of good and evil. Their struggle was depicted on the walls of the temple of Edfu. When Set was finally defeated, Heru was declared the legitimate ruler of Kemet. Heru was miraculously transformed into a falcon and flew into heaven to receive his father's blessings. Upon returning to Kemet, Heru reclaimed his father's throne. At the moment of Heru's coronation, Asar was resurrected and declared ruler of the afterlife when he ascended to the throne of judgment. Father and son were now co-regents. Heru ruled the physical world in Kemet, and Asar ruled the spiritual realm in heaven. Horus. Dozens of temples were built in Kemet, and each had a pair of tekenu at the entrance, one standing to the left and one to the right. The tekken on the left represented yesterday. The one on the right symbolized tomorrow. The entrance to the temple represented today, the space which exists between yesterday and tomorrow. A pair of tekenu also represented the complementary and dual aspects of life, a male and female nature. 4,000 years ago, there were more than 1,200 tekenu in Kemet. Today, in Egypt, there are only 7. The tekken that once stood to the right of the entrance of Luxor Temple was removed in 1833. It now stands at the Place de la Concorde in Paris, France. There is a tekken in Central Park in New York City, one on the banks of the Thames River in London, England, and another in Istanbul, Turkey. There is a tekken in Vatican City in the center of St. Peter's Square. There are 13 tekenu in Rome, many of which now stand in front of churches located throughout the city. In fact, the architectural design of the church steeple was inspired by the tekenu which stood in front of the temples of Kemet. The story of Asar, Aset, and Heru is embedded within symbolism and architecture throughout Washington, D.C. The mall is laid out in the form of a cross. The Capitol is in the east. The Lincoln Memorial is in the west. The Jefferson Memorial is in the south. And the White House is in the north. In the center of the horizontal and vertical axis of this cross stands the Washington Monument, the ancient symbol representing the resurrected Asar. Not only is the Washington Monument an African symbol, but the idea of a reflection pool is also of African origin. Every temple in Kemet had tekenu, and a sacred lake is seen here in the Temple of Karnak. Washington, D.C. is a city of monuments, and John Russell Pope designed many of them. In 1912, Pope submitted this design to the committee overseeing the creation of a memorial for Abraham Lincoln. It is a scale model of Khufu's Great Pyramid. The memorial committee rejected Pope's drawing because it was unoriginal, but they selected Henry Bacon's original design, which was actually a copy of the Parthenon, a Greek temple. The committee also selected Daniel French's original sculpture of Lincoln sitting in his temple. Further investigation reveals that French's statue of Lincoln was inspired by the statue of Ramesses II at the Temple of Abu Simbel in Egypt. Washington, D.C. is significant because it is the first planned capital built in modern times. It was designed by several of America's Masonic founding fathers, and they devised specific plans for their new capital long before the land was surveyed or the first spade of dirt was turned. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution mandated that the new capital would be no larger than a 10-mile square. In 1791, George Washington, America's first Masonic president, announced that the capital would be built along the Potomac River on land ceded by Maryland on the east bank and Virginia on the west. Washington hired Andrew Ellicott to survey the boundary of the 10-mile square. Ellicott hired Benjamin Banneker, an African scientist and astronomer, to survey the heavens so that the 10-mile square would be properly oriented to the sun, stars, and planets. Banneker worked throughout the night surveying the sky using the most sophisticated instruments of his era. He plotted the rising and setting of celestial bodies and recorded their positions in his notebook. Ellicott arrived at Banneker's work site every day before sunrise. He used Banneker's notes to plot his sight line so that the 10-mile square would be properly aligned to the heavens. These two surveyors worked for 2.5 months, and they complemented each other's efforts. Banneker measured the heavens, and Ellicott measured the earth. Together, they established pathways which directed spiritual energy within the 10-mile square. Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson to supervise the survey and design of the capital city. Jefferson, as per Washington's instructions, told Banneker and Ellicott to begin their survey at Jones Point in Alexandria, Virginia. This was to be the southernmost point of the square. They were told to run a 10-mile sight line to the northwest, make a 90-degree turn, and run a second 10-mile sight line to the northeast, make another 90-degree turn, and run a third sight line to the southeast, make a final 90-degree turn, and run a fourth sight line to the southwest. This would bring them back to their original point of departure at Jones Point. These 4 sight lines formed the 10-mile square. Each corner of the square was perfectly oriented to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. After the survey was completed, Ellicott supervised the placement of 40 boundary markers around the perimeter of the square. Banneker's final assignment was to establish a meridian line which would indicate the midpoint of the 10-mile square and the exact position of the sun at high noon on the vernal equinox. This meridian line not only divided the 10-mile square in half, it also established the meridian as the primary corridor of spiritual energy within the newly created capital. This meridian line is the first stop on our field trip. Before we visit the meridian line, we must acquaint you with the symbolic meaning of 7 numbers that will be referenced throughout our field trip. Numbers have been used for thousands of years to represent esoteric, philosophical, and religious concepts. The numbers 1 through 7 are critical to our study of the city. The number 1 represents the Creator, the source of all life, which was often depicted as the sun. 2 represents man and woman, who were made from the Creator. 3 represents the child, who was made from man and woman acting as co-creators. 4 represents a square, the base or foundation upon which a new life begins. 5 represents man. Man has 5 parts of his body: a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs. Woman has 5 fingers, 5 toes, and 5 senses. Man is actually a Sanskrit word which means mind and has no sexual connotation. In this context, the word woman literally means the womb that produces man or mind. 6 represents death. From the earliest times, the dead were buried in a coffin, a 6-sided box. They were carried to their grave by 6 pallbearers, and they were buried under 6 feet of earth. Originally, the numbers 666 symbolized the death of the body, mind, and spirit of the deceased, and not the devil as we are now taught. 7 represents heaven, the place where the dead are reborn. You now know the story of Asar was the first resurrection story in history. But did you know that the ancient Kemites identified 7 levels of heaven, and that Asar was resurrected in a land called the 7th heaven? In his new role as the Lord of Judgment, one could say that Asar was the first president of the 700 Club. The Washington Monument, at 555 feet high, is the world's tallest freestanding Masonic structure. It is a symbol that represents the capital of the most powerful nation on earth. The Washington Monument is actually a copy of an African monument honoring Asar, the first king of Kemet, who died and was resurrected more than 6,000 years ago. In ancient Kemet, Asar's monument was called a Tekken. Originally, it represented the one part of Asar's body which Set never found, his phallus. After the spirit of Asar impregnated Set, his virgin wife, she gave birth to their son Heru on December 25th. As an adult, Heru avenged the murder of his father and reclaimed the throne of Kemet. After the defeat of Set, Heru took the form of a falcon and flew into heaven to inform Asar of his victory. The victorious Heru was depicted as a winged sun disk called a Heru Bedet. A bedet was carved above the entrance of every temple to commemorate Heru's victory over Set. When Heru reclaimed the throne of Kemet, Asar was reborn as the Lord of Resurrection, and he presided over the souls of the deceased as he sat on the throne of judgment. After Asar was born again, the Tekken represented his victory over death. 6,000 years after the resurrection of Asar, you will find the world's tallest Tekken in Washington, D.C. Inside the Washington Monument, above the elevator and plaque of George Washington, you will find a Heru Bedet, the winged sun disk of Heru. Within the center of the sun disk is a stylized six-pointed star which represents Asar and Set. Asar and Set. You will find Tekkenu in Arlington Cemetery, and a pair of Tekkenu in front of George and Martha Washington's tomb in Mount Vernon, Virginia. There is also a Tekken above Thomas Jefferson's grave in Monticello, Virginia. Are these an unusual series of coincidences, or are they a few of the many secrets which have been hidden in plain sight? Shortly after the founding of the United States of America, George Washington commissioned a team of men to design a great seal to represent the heart and soul of the new nation. It took these men 6 years, from 1776 until 1782, to design the symbols which adorn the back of the dollar bill. As you can probably guess by now, ancient Kemet was the inspiration for their design. There are two Kemetic objects on the reverse of the Great Seal, the pyramid and the all-seeing eye. The pyramid is comprised of 13 rows of stone that are said to represent the 13 colonies that were founded in 1776, the year inscribed in Roman numerals at the base of the pyramid. The inspiration for this design is obviously African because there are more than 300 pyramids in Egypt and the Sudan, but there are no pyramids in the United States or Europe. The eye above the pyramid is said to represent the eye of God, who sees everything that happens on the earth below. This symbol was derived from the eye of Heru. Heru's eye, like that of the Creator, was positioned high above the earth and able to see everything that happened on the planet. The image of Heru as a falcon was the national symbol for ancient Kemet. It also was the inspiration for the eagle as the national symbol of the United States in front of the Great Seal. When you compare both symbols, you can see the similarity between the two. What is important to note is that the symbol on the right was created 6,000 years before the symbol on the left. Both creatures are birds of prey. Both are looking to their right, and both have stars above their heads. Is this a coincidence, or is it another secret hidden in plain sight? The Library of Congress is the greatest repository of culture and knowledge in the history of mankind. It contains more than 125 million artifacts from around the world. The Thomas Jefferson Building was the first of 3 structures now known as the Library of Congress. Built in 1897, the Jefferson Building is the oldest cultural institution in the city. There are 33 heads above the first floor windows at the entrance, rear, and four corners of the Jefferson Building. They were designed to represent the 33 races that inhabit the earth. Upon closer examination, you will see that these heads actually represent much more. There are 4 heads at the entrance on First Street. They represent the Russian Slav, blonde European, brunette European, and the modern Greek. Some of the heads on the southern corners represent the Persian, Hindu, Semite, Polynesian, and Australian. Some of the heads on the northern corners represent the Fijian, Plains Indian, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese. The 5 heads at the rear of the library on 2nd Street represent the Negrito, Zulu, Papuan, Sudan Negro, and the Aka. What do these 33 heads mean? As you recall, the number 4 represents foundation. Thus, the 4 heads at the front of the library represent Russia, Northern and Southern Europe, and Greece, the founding civilizations of Europe and the United States. You also recall that the number 5 represents man. Thus, the 5 heads at the rear of the library represent the modern African descendants of Homo sapiens sapien, the first humans. Symbolically, the 33 ethnological heads represent the monogenetic origins of humanity and the speciation of mankind, the kinds of men who evolved from the original man in Africa. More than 110 years ago, men carved secrets in stone. But in the January 11, 1988 issue of Newsweek, geneticists presented irrefutable evidence proving to the world that humanity did begin in Africa more than 200,000 years ago. It is now an accepted fact that the first man and woman were of African origin, and all humanity carries their DNA. A further analysis of the Jefferson Building also suggests that the 33 heads refer to the 33rd degree of Masonry, where members also learn of the monogenetic origins of mankind. If you recall, the temple room on the 2nd floor of the House of the Temple is where the 33rd degree is conferred. The temple room is a cube whose height, width, and depth are 33 feet each. It is also surrounded by 33 columns that are 33 feet high. The heads at the front and rear of the Jefferson Building also relate to the plaques near the door of the Scottish Rite Temple at 16th and Harvard Streets. The plaque on the left reads, "From the east comes light." The plaque on the right reads, "From the west comes law." The east represents light, or the knowledge that came out of Kemet. The west represents the European discovery of the light and its application as the rule of law which governs their society. The 5 African heads at the rear of the Jefferson Building face east and see Khepri, the light of the sun, rising in the east every morning. 4 heads at the front of the Jefferson Building face west. They look at the Capitol, where the laws are made. This is not a coincidence. It was a secret which, up until now, has been hidden in plain sight. There are additional details of the John Adams Building at the Library of Congress that your facilitator will share with you upon your return to the IKG Cultural Resource Center. In the meantime, consider these words of wisdom which were inscribed at the entrance to the James Madison Building of the Library of Congress. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. Entertain questions. Hotep.